Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Fisher, and welcome to my world. And I admit, superhero media is a big part of that world. It's why so many videos on this channel are dedicated to the subject. But whenever you venture into a genre like this, you're bound to encounter efforts at deconstructing, scrutinizing, or just plain lambasting the entire premise. And ever since superhero movies became these big billion-dollar blockbusters, those efforts have become a lot more vocal. While most of that usually boils down to different tastes or needless trolling, I do feel there's a productive way to analyze superhero media, as well as a misguided way. Now, the latter is much easier, simply because it's easy to be misguided on anything by default. But the former is exceedingly difficult because it requires serious, critical thought. Not everyone is willing to do that, and even those that do don't always do it honestly. But to date, I feel like Invincible, both the show and the comic, navigate those difficulties better than anything or anyone else to date. Now, I did follow the comics casually when they first came out, but it was the animated series on Amazon Prime that got me really interested in the themes, the tone, and the true heart of Invincible. I thought Season 1 did a great job of building this new world for those unfamiliar with the source material, but Season 2 really took everything to a new level, and not just in terms of violence and bloodshed. I actually wasn't originally planning to make a video about this show. Yes, I did enjoy it a great deal, but after rewatching a number of episodes and taking some time to process everything that had happened, I actually came to better appreciate the underlying message that this show delivered. And I think it's a relevant message for both Invincible and the superhero genre as a whole. But before this show came out, and even before the current dominance of superhero media at the box office, Invincible was a unique franchise within the genre. It began in the early 2000s, and this was also around the same time as comics like The Boys and The Ultimates were popular. Now, those series were very different in premise, but similar in one key way. They really went hard at deconstructing the very premise of superheroes. They were laced with tones of dark, gritty edginess and satire, making a strong case that if superheroes existed in real life, they would probably be assholes. Their personalities, their egos, and their proclivities, it would be abnormal to say the least, and rarely in a good way. Now, that kind of deconstruction isn't new. Watchmen is probably the most famous example at painting superheroes as toxic, broken people. And that kind of cynical outlook was very mainstream at the time. Then, Invincible comes along and does something similar, but it did not go about it in the same way as The Boys or Watchmen. Yes, it did offer a more critical take on superheroes, but it offered a different kind of criticism. I would even argue that it attempted something much more challenging than even Watchmen. Because what Invincible did in the comics, and what really came through in the first two seasons of the show, revolves around one seemingly inescapable problem. Being a superhero, even if your intentions, your heart, and your soul are in the right place, it's traumatic. And by that, I don't mean it's difficult. I mean it is seriously, punishingly traumatic. On both a mental and physical level, being a superhero, even one with powers on par with Superman, it's a genuinely damaging experience, and there are no superpowers in existence that can protect anyone from that. Now, on the surface, this doesn't seem like a profound revelation. After all, there are plenty of mainstream superhero stories about characters navigating trauma. But those same stories often approach the concept in a way that feels incomplete at best and problematic at worst. Just take any superhero from any major franchise, find any well-known or iconic story arc. More often than not, the heroes will face overwhelming challenges, overpowered enemies, and intense battles that leave serious scars, both mental and physical. And sure, there's a certain amount of trauma that comes with that, but most of the time, it doesn't linger beyond a single story arc. The hero either heals from their wounds or just gets over it. Sometimes it's with the help of friends and loved ones, sometimes they just shrug it off as though they're used to it. And therein lies the problem, because the trauma in those stories rarely comes off as anything more serious than a bump or a bruise. As such, many superheroes heal from this as though they would a broken bone or a bad hangover. In certain respects, it barely even qualifies as trauma. It mostly becomes just bad memories of harsh struggles. But real, actual trauma, that is not something you can brush off like it's a dislocated finger. In the comics, Invincible even acknowledges this early on, albeit not as overtly as the show later did. It really set itself apart from many other superhero comics by vividly depicting the blood, bruises, and damage that being a hero often incurs. And unlike the more cynical deconstructions of superhero stories, it's not at all tied to the characters being assholes or flawed people in general. Even before he gets his superpowers, the main character, Mark Grayson, really does come off as a good, genuine soul. Many other heroes like Adam Eve, Robot, Duplicate, and Monster Girl carry themselves similarly. And in these same comics, the Guardians of the Globe, most of which are modeled after members of the Justice League, conduct themselves as though they know what it means to be a hero, and they appreciate the power, responsibilities, and ideals that come with it. But having the right mentality and having the right heart, that does not protect you from the trauma. And in Mark Grayson's case, it seems to invite trauma. Even as he navigates his journey to become a capable superhero, that trauma often seems to reinforce itself. While this certainly unfolds in the comics in many instances, it's the show that really fleshes this concept out. When we first meet Mark, he carries himself as a fairly normal kid. He just happens to be the son of Omni-Man, a full-blooded alien from the planet Viltrum and one of the most powerful and accomplished superheroes in the world. Naturally, Mark looks up to his father. He also really hopes that he inherited his father's superpowers. He's even a fan of superheroes himself. But this setup also helps establish an important component of Mark's character. He really wants to be a superhero. He really wants to have superpowers, and he really wants to make a good, positive impact on the world around him. Now, Mark's moral core and idealism is identical to that of most Paragon heroes like Superman, and the idea that he might not have inherited his father's powers is actually a troubling thought at first. But then, he discovers in a comically mundane way that this isn't the case. He does indeed have superpowers like his father. Suddenly, his hopes and dreams of being a real superhero feel very real, and he is all too eager to embrace this opportunity. He soon has his very own costume, as well as his own superhero identity, Invincible. And at no point in this part of his superhero journey does trauma enter the picture. He doesn't lose a loved one, he doesn't suffer any major hardship. Mark Grayson already has the heart, spirit, and mentality of a superhero from the get-go, and being half Viltrumite, he essentially hits the jackpot with respect to superpowers. Like his father, he has the strength, speed, agility, and durability of Superman. He can also fly, survive in space, and heal from injuries that would render most heroes a bloody pulp. But it's that last superpower that ends up being very important. Because Mark does go through a lot of growing pains. It's kind of a recurring gag in the first season of the show and how often he gets beat up. And even when he saves the day, he endures a lot of physical punishment. He also has to contend with causing a fair amount of collateral damage, something that often becomes an afterthought for most other mainstream superheroes. But even that issue is largely addressed for him. Because in addition to major heroes like the Guardians of the Globe, the world of Invincible also has the Global Defense Agency. They're a lot like S.H.I.E.L.D. in that they're this secret government organization that monitors, tracks, and coordinates superheroes and various threats. Except they do much more to support these heroes when they're not saving the day. In both the comics and throughout the first 2 seasons of the show, the GDA provides advanced medical care to heroes when they're injured. And whenever there's significant collateral damage, like there often is to Mark's family home, they step in to clean it up. There are no repair bills, there are no insurance forms, there's really even any mention of overdue taxes. For the most part, Mark doesn't have to worry about money or being held liable for the damage he accidentally causes when he saves the day. The GSA, under Cecil Stedman's somewhat shady leadership, takes care of that for him. So in essence, Mark gets to be a superhero under the best possible circumstances. Having the infrastructure of the GSA, the Guardians of the Globe, and his own father, he more than anyone has the easiest possible route to become the hero he strives to be. And yet, he ends up enduring case after case of horrendous trauma. From the physical beatings he takes at the hands of Battle Beast, to the mental torment he endures when he's unable to save a woman during the invasion by the Flaxons, Mark is deeply affected by all of this. It's not something he's able to just brush aside. And this is all before Omni-Man reveals his true agenda, which imparted a far greater trauma. This even extends to when he's not being invincible, trying to balance his life as a superhero and a normal teenager. While other superhero narratives often use this balancing act as fodder for wacky hijinks and moments of dramatic irony, Mark's efforts in both the comics and the show come off as far less healthy. He does try his best. He even manages to get a prototypical non-superpowered girlfriend in Amber Bennett. But there's never a sense that these efforts are sustainable. This doesn't feel like a situation that can be managed in the long term. But that's less a commentary on the structure of overplayed tropes and more a byproduct of not managing trauma in a healthy way. In many respects, Mark's approach is understandable. Being a fan of superheroes himself, he has this idea of how a hero is supposed to operate. And he tried to use all the incredible opportunities afforded to him to maintain those ideals. But none of the comics he ever read highlighted the toll it would take on him. Beyond just being late for dates with his girlfriend, being a hero is just inescapably traumatic. It doesn't matter that he's invincible in a very real physical sense. He is not immune to experiencing that trauma, and it always seems to find him even when he's not in costume. And then the truth about Omni-Man is revealed. From there, the painful, blood-soaked beating that inspired so many memes ensues. And this just makes all that trauma he's already endured so much worse. Because suddenly, the father that Mark idolized, the hero who helped set the standard by which Mark measured himself, he was no longer an inspiration. He was just another source of pain. Even though Mark healed from the physical punishment that his father imparted, the mental toll lingers all throughout season 2 of the show. It even seems to get progressively worse towards the end. Mark shows clear signs of PTSD on multiple occasions, and it's never framed as something he can just get over as so many other heroes seem to do. It's just always with him, regardless of whether he's Mark Grayson or Invincible. And what I think makes Invincible so powerful in general as a story is that Mark never loses sight of what it means to be a hero. It doesn't matter how much his father hurt him. It doesn't matter how much damage he ends up doing to his world or his loved ones. Mark still believes in the same heroic ideals he did before he got his powers. He still has the heart and soul of a superhero. But holding on to that perspective the way he does, it's repeatedly, continually traumatizing him. He keeps trying to do the right thing, and at times in season 2 of the show, he seems even more motivated. His father is no longer his idol, but Mark is still very determined to be the hero Omni-Man never truly was, and for all the right reasons. But doing the right thing, being a hero in the most classic sense of the term, he keeps getting punished for it. And it's not because he's careless, stupid, or incompetent. The world around him and the many people within it just seems intent on undermining his brand of paragon heroism. And Mark, despite his best efforts, just doesn't know how to deal with it. By the time we get to the end of season 2, it's genuinely heartbreaking, watching Mark struggle to process everything that's happening to him. Now, in a few cases, what happens to him is a consequence of his own actions, but most of the time, it's just a byproduct of a broken world that keeps trying to make him into someone he does not want to be. We even learned there are other universes in which Mark does succumb to that pressure. There are actually all these dark, dystopian worlds in which he and his father essentially conquer Earth. Here, Mark has no sense of heroism or ideals, and he carries himself in a way that shows he's not the least bit bothered by it. Without the burden of being a hero, he suffers little to no trauma. It really is a powerful contrast compared to all the anguish that Mark endures. One of the main antagonists of season 2, Angstrom Levy, even said that universes where Mark abandons his heroic ideals are much more common. But that only helps us, the audience, appreciate Mark's efforts even more. At every turn, Invincible does a lot to explore the trauma and burdens that Mark deals with, but he is not the only one who suffers through this journey. In fact, nearly every supporting character around him, including others who aren't even superheroes, are unable to escape the trauma. Adam Eve's entire origins, which is beautifully depicted in a single special episode, paints her as someone every bit as innately heroic as Mark. Much like him, she was born with her powers, courtesy of experiments done to her mother while she was pregnant. And thanks to the efforts of Professor Brandyworth, she's spared from being turned into a living weapon by the government. She actually gets to live a normal life as Samantha Wilkins. But even before she becomes a superhero, she experiences difficulties that certainly qualify as traumatic. Her powers manifest suddenly when she's just a preteen, and like Mark, they're very broad, being able to manipulate matter on an atomic level. Initially, she thinks they're great, she even has fun with them. But then, as soon as she demonstrates them to her only friend, she gets weirded out and completely cuts ties with her. This leads Eve to feeling isolated and alone, feelings that no superpowers can protect her from. But even with these burdens, Samantha Wilkins has the inherent heart of a hero. Sure, she could easily use her powers to become rich, successful, and selfish, but she wants to be a hero. Despite having less than supportive parents who just want a normal child, she embraces her Adam Eve persona early on. But unfortunately, doing so attracts attention from her creators. She's told outright by Professor Brandyworth that she needs to stop using her powers, otherwise the same people who hurt her mother could come after her. But Not using her powers means not being a hero. It means not helping people. And that's just not something that Eve is willing to do. From a purely heroic standpoint, Adam Eve does the right thing for the right reasons. But it also directly leads her to a very brutal, very punishing encounter with her creators, who have since created a series of monstrous siblings. These individuals are part of her family, but she ultimately has to kill every one of them. Now, this kind of thing is traumatic enough for adults, but Eve had to do this when she was just a kid. And it hurts her on a much deeper level. Even though she effectively saves the day, her origin story still ends with her crying in her room, hurt and in pain at what she's lost. It's a powerful but heartbreaking moment, because for her, willingly choosing the heroic path still leads to trauma that she'll never truly be over. That special really helped frame Adam Eve in Season 1 in a new light, because while her past isn't mentioned, she does come off as the most capable, well-adjusted member of the team. Her trauma didn't stop her from wanting to be a hero, and when living with her parents and working under the GSA became too frustrating, she decides to strike out on her own, creating her own home and forging her own path. She, more than anyone, is in a position to be the kind of hero who can minimize complications. She even takes it a step further, using her powers to help people in ways that don't just involve fighting aliens. And yet, Adam Eve is still unable to escape further trauma. Early on in Season 2 of the show, everything Adam Eve is doing seems to be working. She's not just helping out other heroes, she's building up communities, creating parks for children, and making areas destroyed by superhero battles even better. But, once again, her good deeds don't go unpunished. Her parents, who still want nothing more than for her to be normal, reveal that these nice things do still have consequences. And, like it or not, they're her responsibility. Remember, Adam Eve is still a teenager. That in and of itself is overwhelming enough. But the idea that her efforts to help people are doing more harm than good really does get to her. Then, in her agitated state, an elderly couple nearly drowns because she's not focused because of this trauma. And even though that couple survives, it's still enough to trigger her. It gets her to start questioning her entire approach to being a hero. However, at no point does she consider abandoning those heroic ideals. Like Mark, her heroic nature remains intact. Her capacity to do the right thing doesn't change. But the simple act of maintaining this heroic outlook, it still invites trauma. And there are plenty of other instances of other young heroes experiencing something similar. Duplicate and Robot each have their own personal journeys that invite serious mental strain. But even the Immortal, the lone survivor of Omni-Man's attack on the Guardians of the Globe, shows a certain level of collective trauma, especially when he thinks Duplicate is dead. Even multiple lifetimes of heroism can't avoid it. Just the mere act of being a hero means being constantly traumatized, even when you save the day. By the end of Season 2 of the show, this inescapable link between being a superhero and suffering trauma is very apparent. But Invincible still manages to add another layer of complexity to the mix. After Season 1, there is no question that Mark Grayson was the primary villain. He killed the Guardians of the Globe in cold blood. He lied to Mark, his wife, and the entire world about who he was and what his agenda entailed. And the way he brutally beat up Mark, as if to try to beat the heroism out of him, it made him seem utterly irredeemable. And yet, in that same final episode, Omni-Man 2 endures his first taste of trauma. The second he realizes he can't complete his mission on behalf of the Viltrumite Empire, the second he realizes he loves his wife and son in a way he never intended, it hurts him in a way he's never experienced before. Given that this is a man powerful enough to punch an asteroid out of orbit, it truly is a different kind of pain. But Season 2 twisted the knife even more for Nolan, and it did so without trying too hard to redeem or forgive his earlier atrocities. While he's processing this new pain, he finds himself caring for another alien species. He even ends up having another son with a Thraxan woman. On some levels, he's basically making the same decisions that led to so much pain before. But from a story perspective, that actually works here because it reveals an important turn within Nolan. He's now choosing to be the hero he only pretended to be in the first season. And he's also choosing to actively go against his Viltrumite heritage. Now understandably, Mark does not believe this when he reunites with his father. Even after he agrees to help with his new half-brother, there's no hint that he's going to forgive his father for what he's done. But, despite all the harsh things Mark says, Omni-Man still doesn't slip back into his old ways. And when more Viltrumites arrive to arrest him and take his sons, Nolan chooses to fight them. Moreover, he actually shows that he cares what happens to Mark and the Thraxans. At times, he actively admits he hates this, caring for lesser beings, even those not related to him. That kind of heroic inclination isn't just unnatural to him, it's antithetical to everything a Viltrumite stands for. He has spent his entire life doing the exact opposite of this, only ever doing heroic acts while having decidedly unheroic intentions. But now, he has the same heroic inclinations as his son. Even though he might be a more experienced and capable Viltrumite, this leaves him vulnerable. And the other Viltrumites take full advantage of that. They're actually able to bludgeon him, subdue him, and send him to prison to be executed. Nolan more than anyone knows what's in store for him. He even seems to know that he and Mark weren't strong enough to defeat 3 full-blooded Viltrumites, none of which were burdened by the traumas of heroism. But even though he loses the fight, he's still able to save Mark and his infant son. That does count as a heroic sacrifice, and from the same man who nearly beat his son to death in the previous season. But even if this counts as a success by that measure, Omni-Man still endures plenty of trauma. Even if you think he deserves it, it still fits the overarching narrative of Invincible as a whole. For Omni-Man, doing the right thing for the wrong reason made him invincible in every sense of the word. But doing the right thing for the right reason? That left him beaten, battered, and utterly broken. Nolan goes from one of the mightiest heroes on Earth and a champion of Viltrum to a prisoner destined for suffering and death. That was his reward for deciding to be a real hero. And yet, at no point does he seem to show any regret for this choice. There's even a strange, oddly human moment at the end of Season 2 when he says he misses his wife, the same wife he actually called a pet at the end of Season 1. It's still difficult at times to feel sympathetic for Omni-Man after everything he's done, but by this point, it feels like he really is suffering, and he's suffering in a way that none of his fellow Viltrumites can inflict, let alone understand. Essentially, Omni-Man joins Mark, Adam Eve, and a long list of other characters in this harsh lesson in heroism. He shows that even if you're not born with innately heroic tendencies, choosing a heroic path later on doesn't protect you from the trauma. Now, taking a step back, when you look at Omni-Man's journey, coupled with that of Mark and Adam Eve, and all the other characters surrounding them, the overarching message is painfully, viscerally clear. Being a superhero is traumatic. Choosing the path of a superhero means enduring trauma, and no amount of superpowers will protect you from that. It's an undeniably darker, more subversive take on the superhero genre, and Invincible does plenty to send the message that being a superhero comes with serious dangers that nobody's equipped to handle, regardless of how powerful they might be. It also doesn't attempt to hide the uglier, more painful aspects that often come with going on the hero's journey. But, unlike other deconstructions of superhero media, Invincible invites us, the fans of superhero media, to appreciate acts of heroism even more. It takes the idea that no good deed goes unpunished to a horrifying extreme, and even in a world where superheroes as powerful as Omni-Man exists, nobody is immune to that trauma. And even as these heroes endure it, even as their choice to continue being a hero invites more and more painful burdens, they still continue along this heroic path. Their moral compass, their heart, and their spirit, it still doesn't break. Now, you can still argue that Invincible is a deeply critical take on superheroes. It allows things to get dark, ugly, and bloody. It also overtly parodies known characters with familiar narratives. But the way it goes about telling its story, aligning heroic acts with inescapable trauma, it evokes a different impact from other critical takes. In many respects, Invincible's approach to superheroes helps us, the audience, appreciate them even more. It gives us a memorable cast of characters that feel human and vulnerable. It also gives us a world full of powerful villains, major threats, and countless complications. To be a hero under these circumstances isn't just daunting, it's detrimental. And yet, there are still those who choose that path. They know that more trauma awaits them, and no amount of power, strength, or capabilities will protect them from that. But they still willingly endure it. They keep trying to be the best superhero they can possibly be. You can still criticize the premise, the genre, and the fanciful plots of superhero media all you want. But Invincible shows that, even through a critical lens, there is something truly heroic and heartfelt at the core of it all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.